Hi again, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David J. Baldovin, and I'm a retired FBI agent. In part one of my Phil Haney interview, I introduced you to an American patriot. I am again honored on this near one-year anniversary of his death to share more of Phil Haney with you. I would like to elaborate somewhat, if I may, for those who might not yet grasp, be familiar with, or might be misinformed of what Phil Haney is referring to in part one as the purge or the Great Purge. To put it succinctly, certain officials of our own government agencies undermined their own investigators' ability to use Islamic doctrine as motivations behind jihadi attacks by removing, purging, if you will, honest factual training and any reference to Islam and its doctrine from training materials used to train our agents, as well as the removal of the instructors themselves. This willful, purposeful subversion thereafter trickles down to state and local law enforcement agencies and fusion centers that look to the federal government for guidance. This is not anti-Muslim, ladies and gentlemen. If you believe that, then you have been successfully influenced. A Muslim is a person. All people who call themselves Muslims don't necessarily act on, believe in, or even know of the jihad called for in their doctrine. It is also not offensive or hateful, to quote directly verses from Islamic doctrine. I believe offensive is the term that was used for the purge. Things that were deemed offensive about either Middle Eastern culture or Islam. And one might ask, deemed by whom? Would they be approved Islamic sources, as was admitted to by a retired FBI agent who had been assigned to a joint terrorism task force who told me she was spoon-fed certain verses of Quranic doctrine? Are we to assume that the Muslim Brotherhood deems quotations from Quranic sources offensive or hateful? No, ladies and gentlemen, that is the propaganda and the lies that you are being asked to believe. This is the deceit of the unbeliever. They just don't want you to know what is contained in the doctrine. Why might you think that FBI agents told Haney they learned more in 2 hours with him than in their previous careers? They have been influenced, undermined by our own people. This is not rocket science, folks. All one has to do is refer to one paragraph on page 7 of the explanatory memorandum, a Muslim Brotherhood generated document, to see for oneself what the Muslim Brotherhood intends to try and do, and to use our own to help them do it. Officials of our own government are thereby aiding and abetting a self-proclaimed enemy and not abiding by a government's most basic function by not securing or protecting your natural right to be safe and secure from enemies, foreign and domestic. This would be tantamount to having the likes of Joseph Goebbels or Willie Musenberg training our national security apparatus. In this part 2 upcoming video interview with Phil Haney, we will hopefully round out more for you of what we discussed in part 1, as well as provide you with some new information. You will learn more history and more behind the scenes of the Boston Marathon bombing. Here again, ladies and gentlemen, is Phil Haney, part 2. I will have a few parting comments at the conclusion of part 2. Thank you. I can see geographically, Phil, how Islam spread up and out to the west through North Africa, but how you described the Asian subcontinent and the spreading of sharia to the Indian subcontinent and across to Indonesia. Can you just take a few moments and explain how that happened? I mean, has it happened because the civilizational jihad, so to speak, has spread out like colonies, like you were describing yesterday, and made its way across the Asian continent as far as places like Indonesia? How did that physically happen?
After Muhammad died in 632, there was a succession of 4 rightly guided caliphs, leaders, and we know more about their campaigns to go west,
Right.
culminating in crossing the Gibraltar in the year 711 into Spain, and eventually meeting Charles Martel, the Catholic King of France, on the plains of Tours in France in the year 721. But what we don't know as much about is the fact that they were also going east, not just west. And it was the largest genocidal campaign probably in the history of the world, especially when they came through Persia, Iran, they continued on through Afghanistan, and they encountered Hindustan, India, home of the Taj Mahal, for example, and precipitated the largest genocide probably in human history of slaughter and conquering. And they didn't stop there. They went clear through into modern day Bangladesh, modern day Myanmar, and established, when it was all said and done, in 100+ years after the death of Muhammad, the largest empire that has ever existed in history. It's bigger than the biblical Greek Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the Roman Empire, bigger than all of them. And so these aspirations of the global caliphate are actually very plausible in the Islamic mind, because they have already, at some time past in history, in their golden era of Islam, actually conquered most of the known world at the time. And so their aspirations, as they look forward, are based on their past history. So it's very plausible for them to have a revival and to re-establish the caliphate ruled by sharia everywhere from the Far East clear to the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. And that's only the Eastern Hemisphere we're talking about. But that's the history in a nutshell.
We always learned about the Moors. Where did the name Moors come from?
Moor is the same origin as Morocco.
I got it. Okay.
And the leader of the Moors was a guy named Tariq, Ibn Tariq. And he led the Muslim armies across the Straits of Gibraltar in the year 711 into the continent of Europe. And there's a mountain that's named after him, a prominent geographical landmark. In Arabic, it's called Jibal Tariq. In anglicized, it's Gibraltar. The mountain Gibraltar is actually from Arabic, Jibal Tariq. Jebel means mountain of Tariq. So it's a memorial to him. And he crossed the year 711, and as I mentioned earlier, by the year 721, he was encountering the last wall of resistance at that time, the Catholic King of France named Charles Martel, at the plain of Tours, and was turned back. Islam never advanced significantly past that northern point. If they had lost, meaning Charles Martel's army would have fallen, there would have been nothing to stop them clear to Scandinavia. So the tide, essentially, the force of the wave of the tide stopped in the plains of France in the year 721. But they remained in Europe, particularly in Spain, clear up to Ferdinand and Isabella, the year 1492. So that's one macro tactical way to saturate into a culture, is through the bottom-up process, from the grassroots up. And of course, you have allies, catalysts, if you will, that help increase the rate of that saturation. Okay?
Got it.
But that's not the only tactic. That's only one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is pressure from above. If you're not happy with the rate of saturation in the sponge, you just push on it from above. Put more pressure on the sponge, and that rate increases the rate of saturation. So here's the $64,000 question, or the paradox of this allegory, is that you cannot take the solution to prevent this saturation is not taking the sponge out of the water. You can't do it, because that's the world that we live in. It's an impossible thing. So the question is, if the whole story is, how do you prevent the water from saturating into the sponge if you can't take the sponge out of the water?
Solid question.
There's an answer to it. It's called the Constitution. Remember, we're talking about the sponge called America. The Constitution is designed to protect us from that kind of saturation, and from the force from above too. It's actually a stronger protection than any physical wall that we could ever build. And the reason why we're being saturated is because we're not going by the principles of the Constitution. For example, we hear virtually every day by the Democratic Party that Trump is destroying our democracy. This is not a democracy. It's a constitutional republic.
Right.
So if you see candidates or politicians saying that Trump is destroying the democracy, that person in that statement right there is abrogating his constitutional duty. It's not a democracy. And the problem with the democracy versus a constitutional republic is that there's no checks and balances form of government. So therefore, if the judiciary and the legislative and the administrative branches of the government, the executive branch of the government, are all in the same political party, you have no recourse. You have no. If you find yourself on the wrong side of the narrative, there's nowhere for you to turn. See, that's the danger of majority rule.
Yep.
And so all of this noise that we're hearing from the Democratic progressive leftists, I call them the Antifa progressive leftist socialists, the Apples, APLS, always talking about democracy, but what they're really talking about is destroying the constitutional republic, the checks and balances form of government, and replacing with so-called fair and equal democracy, which it never has been in history. And that's where the Muslim Brotherhood comes in. They're perfectly capable of assuming that shape and helping increase the saturation process from the bottom up. They're accomplishing more so far than they ever probably dreamed they would, without firing a single shot. That's why they say we renounce terrorism, because they're accomplishing more by their tactic now than they ever would with terrorism. Terrorism just makes us mad. But what they're doing is like hypnotizing us to sleep. And gradually, day by day by day, this sponge saturates more with more and more water. So the way to stop it is to waterproof the sponge. Of all the times that I was ever betrayed, and I'm not happy to have to say this, of all the times that I was ever betrayed, it was never by a Democrat. It was always by a Republican, every single time. And I'm a conservative myself. I'm a constitutional conservative. That's what I call myself. I don't call myself a Republican or an independent. I call myself a constitutional conservative. I took an oath of office to help protect America and uphold the Constitution. That means I am by default, because of the oath, like yours says, the oath is not retired. We are by default, by our oath of office, constitutional conservatives. We want to preserve it and protect it. So it's no wonder, friend, if we can normalize the killing of our own children, that we also simultaneously become incapable of recognizing the nature of the threats around us.
Right.
Why would we worried about jihad if we can normalize our killing of our own children? You can't. It's psychologically impossible. It's like smashing your thumb and you having a little splinter in your little finger. You don't even feel the splinter in your little finger because your thumb. And that's the way we have such a major injury in our culture of normalizing the killing of our own children, that we're blinded. to the reality of the threats that we face. That's why even within our own alliance, even with the conservative movement, we seem to still not nonetheless have this strange dreamlike incapability of responding to the threat, because we haven't really addressed the real nature of the core of the problem in our own culture yet. If tomorrow we stopped it and we started valuing the life of every individual, including the unborn, we wouldn't be arguing about sanctuary cities, would we?
Is the word religion the stumbling block of this whole thing regarding the Islamic movement?
No, I think it's not. Our fundamental lack of education and awareness of the Constitution. It's not a First Amendment issue. Freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and so on from the First Amendment does not insulate Islam. The issue is that we don't realize that that's, first of all, it's the First Amendment. Amendment to what? The original article of the Constitution. It's an addition. So what is the actual provision in the Constitution that cuts to the heart of the debate about Sharia law, which is the real issue, not freedom of expression, is Article 6, that the U.S. Constitution should be the supreme law of the land.
Right.
Now, the fact that this is the indictment. The fact that our elected officials don't simply stand on that article and say, we have a constitutional republic, checks and balances form of government, we allow freedom of expression and freedom of worship, but we will not allow a code of law that is self-defined as a code of law with its own kind of constitution to come in and take root in our country. No. But we don't talk like that, do we? We don't debate it. We're always constantly in a squirrel cage argument about whether it violates the First Amendment, when it's actually much more fundamental than that.
Right.
Because the First Amendment is built up on the top, like the second story of a house, on Article 6. It's interpreted through the article. It doesn't usurp, it doesn't supersede the article. It's simply built on top of it with the fundamental intuitive understanding that whatever provisions are provided in that amendment don't violate the original articles. In other words, a religion, whatever it is, does not supersede Article 6. And that's the problem, is that from the very beginning, we've never addressed this in the way that it should have been in terms of the argument, the constitutional argument. And we see the result of it, don't we?
Right. I guess that.
Heard a chorus of declarations from the House or the Senate that we cannot allow Sharia law? Now, there is a movement at the state level, right? The ALAC movement.
Yep.
And it's gained some momentum. But who in particular is the group that's pushing against that? CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations. Now, why would CARE be pushing back when on one side of their mouth they say they believe in the Constitution and the freedoms that America provides, but at the other hand they simultaneously say an ALAC law is racist and discriminatory? Because the last thing they want to do is have their real long-term goal stifled, which is normalization of Sharia, saturation into the culture. And
you mentioned one of the agencies that was involved in the investigations against you was state. Am I correct? Department of State?
No, it was Department of Justice. The Department of State is the agency that deleted the case, that insisted that the classified information would be removed. It was
okay. Okay.
The investigation.
Okay. You said there were three agencies.
Yeah, Department of Justice,
DHS,
DHS Inspector General, Customs and Border Protection, Internal Affairs.
Okay. I was incorrect on that. Okay. Did you intimate though that this might have been directed out of the State Department? Or
What I intimated was that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, in cooperation with Janet Napolitano, Secretary of Homeland Security,
right,
endorsed the structure and authorized the actions to destroy those cases. And then also by either passive or deliberate action, authorize the investigation of people like me.
right,
It
okay,
wasn't just enough that they should ignore it, A, delete it, B, but C, they had to go to the next level and go after individuals who they began to gradually see as the real criminal. People like me who were violating the civil rights and civil liberties of foreign nationals. That's the thing to keep in mind. These are not U.S. citizens.
right,
But Obama essentially extended constitutional protection. It's so odd. It's bizarre. He was more focused on providing constitutional protections to non-citizens than he was protecting the rights of American citizens. And I don't think there's too many stories that really illustrate the depth of the dysfunction in the law enforcement community that had developed by this point in time, which was in the year 2013, a year after the Great Purge. In May of 2009, I created what was called a MOIR, Memorandum of Information Received, and in the system you can link records together, and then I put together a background narrative document on a network of organizations centered around the Islamic Society of Boston of 118 different linked individuals and organizations. And it led all the way up to Al-Qaeda, Hamas, you name it. Terrorist fundraising, banks, organizations, the whole big network, from right centered in the Islamic Society of Boston. Okay? That was in May of 2009. Comes April 15th, 2013, the Boston Marathon bombing. I'm a law enforcement officer. What, as you well know, when a case breaks, when an event happens, if you have any nexus to the case, it's your job to go and look and see if there's something that you might have done, some piece of evidence that you might have in the course of your work over the years that might connect, right, to the case. In other words, everybody's looking for who did it. Because at that point of the time, I'm talking minutes, hours after the bombing, I'm looking up, I'm querying my records. Islamic Society of Boston, because I have a pretty good idea that these two guys are connected somewhere. They're not just like radioactive isotopes just floating around in the universe. They're connected somewhere. So I start looking. Well, it was only a few hours before the name of a guy named Al-Harbi, Abdul Rahman Al-Harbi, came out. He's the young kid that was tackled at the site of the bombing, taken by PD to the hospital and treated for injuries to his legs. Subsequently interviewed by the FBI, who then subsequently went to his apartment and carted out the proverbial boxes and bags of stuff out of his apartment, and then reported what they found to the NTCT, the National Terrorism, I forget the acronym, Center, and they all sit down and they have a discussion about what they find, and then they call where I work, National Targeting Center. And they say they want us to open what is called a TF, a Targeting Framework Event, which is basically a fill-in-the-blank dossier kind of a file that helps the rest of the law enforcement community come up to speed on any particular given individual. The biometrics, dates, births, passports, all that stuff. Because we were the ones that had access to it. No other agency did. So they would call NTC. We made a targeting framework on this guy named Mohammed Al-Harbi. Abdul Rahman Al-Harbi. That was 0600 in the morning on Monday. I had access to it because I worked at the NTC. So I looked it up. I figured if there's anything going on upstairs up at NTC, at this point I was in Atlanta, maybe it'll lead to some other points of contact with the case that I've already worked on. And so I looked it up, and as I told you yesterday, my motto was, if it was worth looking up, it's worth keeping. So I always kept everything that I looked up. Well, it became very apparent as time went on that the ISB was involved. And this is, by the way, remember, before we knew that the Tsarnaev brothers were involved. Al-Harbi was the only first suspect, not the Tsarnaev brothers. They didn't find them till Thursday afternoon. So for 3 days, the only actual focus subject was Abdul Rahman Al-Harbi, a kid that doesn't exist. That's according to the federal government. He didn't exist. That's what Napolitano said. Anyhow, in the course of my querying, remember I was telling you about the case with the 118 records built around the ISB, Islamic Society of Boston? And I'm sorry if I go on long, but these details are important. And I appreciate your patience in listening, because this is really one of those points of history that's going to come out eventually, and it'll be part of the history of our country, what actually happened behind the Boston Marathon bombing. Would you like to guess, in the hours and days after the bombing, how many times any of those 118 records that were linking the nexus to the ISB were actually queried by anyone, underline, emphasize anyone in the law enforcement community? Exactly. Now here's even the more important question. As time went on and they discovered the Tsarnaev brothers connection and so on, how many people queried the records after that?
Same number? Zero.
Absolutely. Not even the most basic fundamental level of law enforcement inquiry into the network that was already established there in Boston. Not one single person.
That's amazing.
So, it's a long way of getting around the story where I started about Vali, the Imam of the Islamic Society of Boston, who in an interview 2 or 3 or 4 days after the bombing said, oh, we can't be we can't be radical because the law enforcement, FBI and DHS and so on have been doing outreach and violent dialogue with us for the last 4 years. Exactly the same time frame as when I first put the information into the system in May of 2009, up until the bombing in April of 2013, is exactly the same time frame that they were doing outreach and dialogue with Bali, the Imam of the Islamic Society of Boston. No wonder nobody ever queried any of the records. They weren't looking to investigate them. They were doing dialogue and outreach and giving each other awards. President Obama chose Vali and the ISB as a model Muslim community to put the Countering Violent Extremism program into place in Boston. The other 2 communities was Minneapolis-St. Paul and Los Angeles, California. Boston was one of the 3. Now, how do you think a person like myself, who's putting in shelves and shelves and shelves of archived, detailed, classified information on these networks, goes into the system and sees that for 4 solid years, not one single person anywhere in the law enforcement community ever queried any of those records that were put in there. And that was bad enough. But then after the marathon bombing happened, to see that not one single person queried any of the records after the bombing.
Scenario.
I'll tell you one more thing that's even more incredible. That kid that doesn't exist, Al Harvey, was allowed to come back into the country secretly. First he went back to Saudi Arabia, then he came back. And you know why they let him come back?
I don't.
He sued Glenn Beck for slander and defamation.
You know, I think way back somewhere I heard that.
The kid that didn't exist, according to Janet Napolitano, in open public testimony before the House Committee around 14:30 on Thursday, the 18th of, I think it was Thursday, the 18th of April, said there was no Saudi individual who was a person of interest, a subject of interest, who was ever subject to deportation related to the Boston Marathon bombing. And I don't know where you got your information, but it's so full of misapprehension and misinformation that I'm not even going to answer your question. That's what he told to the vice chairman of the committee, the Homeland Security Committee, in public. When I'm sitting there in my office looking literally at the information in the targeting framework that says specifically that Al Harvey is going to be deported on 3B charges back to Saudi Arabia. And that, my friend, is why I got in so much trouble. That's the basis of the last 3 investigations, was they had to find a way. Now they're really serious. So they got to find a way to discredit me because I've just put it right out, and I gave it to the committee. They knew already before she even testified that she was lying. Meaning, let me rephrase that. They knew when she gave them the answer, that what I call the 3 no's, that she was lying.
The 2 planes on the Twin Towers, we have, when I say we, I'm talking about my colleagues, agents, first responder types, physical first responder types that are dying, and other law enforcement too.
Yeah.
From cancer-related diseases.
Yes.
From responding to the Pentagon and to the World Trade Center. And when I have posed this question one time to a retired agent who was friends with one of these persons who died, I asked the question, well, why did she die? What caused her death? And I got this was done via email, and I swear the feeling that I got is if I would have been sitting in front of her, that it would have been like deer in the headlights. There was a disconnect. And what do you mean? Why did they die? Well, it's an aberration of a faith. And I go, it's not an aberration.
Yeah.
So that's the other disconnect, that, and psychosis, as pathology, whatever you want to call it.
Would you rather die from something that was an aberration, or die from something that was deliberate and intentional? Which one actually means more? To die by some weird fluke accident, or die in part of something that's been going on for 1400 years?
Yep.
Which one is actually more meaningful, and in terms of purpose of life and what you actually represent? You see, the ugliness of it is when you misidentify the reason, you actually diminish the value of the lives of the people that died in it. It didn't mean anything. It was just a one-off aberration. There's no real connection to anything. It just happened like you got hit on the head by a meteor. Oh, well, too bad. Versus you actually were part of this global ideological conflict that started 1400 years ago, and you are now among many hundreds of millions of people that were touched by this ugliness throughout history, and that one day actually arrived on the doorstep of America.
Yep.
Which one is actually more meaningful? And that's what I call abortion. See, we don't just abort children. I shouldn't say to you, anyone watching from now on, do you know the names of the people at Boston? Do you know any of the names of the people at Orlando? Do you know any of the names of the people at San Bernardino? Do you know what subsequently happened to them? Have you any contact or idea of their families and their connections? Any at all? The answer will be almost always no.
Right.
And why is that? Because we not only abort our own children, we abort these incidents out of our life. We erase them off the blackboard. They'd never happen. And that's the reason that, to me, that is so infuriating, that we keep repeating this same narrative over and over. It has no connection to anything. It's just some sad accident that it happened. No, it's just the opposite.
Thank you again for watching and listening, ladies and gentlemen. I mentioned and commented on the purge in my introduction to this Part 2 interview. I want to take that further with regard to retired FBI agents, or anyone for that matter, who may be out there training state and local law enforcement agencies about this threat. If they are not including in their presentations the doctrinal motivations of jihadis, then they are lying to and subverting our own law enforcement brothers. Whether they know it or not, they've been influenced but may not know it. Now, regarding Phil Haney's death and the discovery of his body on February 21st of 2020. I obviously do not know, nor does anyone at this point, if Phil Haney took his own life or not. There are reasons which should be obvious for me to doubt that he did. These would include the location of his body and the fact that he discussed the possibility with several people that if anything should ever happen to him, he did not commit suicide. I hope and pray that the lead investigator, or any investigator for that matter, with the Amador County Sheriff's Office leaves no stone unturned, like should be done with any death investigation. I hope they have interviewed anyone who was in touch with Phil, anyone who could possibly have any information to provide. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen, and please pray for our country.